Before we get started, give this video a like and subscribe if this kind of deep dive storytelling is your thing. And let me know in the comments, where are you watching from, and what time is it there right now? Night in New Brunswick, New Jersey, settles with a hush that feels almost sacred. The year is 1922, and the world outside the city's boundaries is a patchwork of farmland and tangled woodland, where the hum of insects and the distant whistle of a train are the only reminders of civilization. On the outskirts, DeRussey's Lane snakes through wild grass and overgrown hedgerows, a lover's lane by reputation and a place where secrets thrive in the shadows. It is here, in the early hours of September 16th, that the silence is broken, not by the laughter of clandestine couples or the rumble of a passing car, but by the discovery that will haunt this community for generations. Beneath the gnarled branches of a crabapple tree, two bodies lie side by side. The man's head is turned slightly toward the woman, as if in his final moments he sought to comfort her, or perhaps to confess. The woman's hands are folded across her chest, her face frozen in an expression that is neither peaceful nor terrified, but something in between. The first to stumble upon the scene is a group of local youths, drawn by the promise of adventure and the thrill of trespassing on forbidden ground. What they find instead is a tableau of death. The man, later identified as Reverend Edward Wheeler Hall, is dressed immaculately, his suit only slightly rumpled, his shoes polished to a dull shine. At his feet lies a calling card, the crisp white rectangle bearing his name in elegant script, a detail so deliberate it seems almost staged. Beside him, Eleanor Reinhardt Mills, a choir singer at his church and a married woman, is dressed in a simple dress, her throat slashed, her body arranged with a strange and unsettling care. Between them, scattered like confetti, are the remnants of torn love letters. The words, half legible, half lost to the dew and the mud, speak of longing, of secrecy, of a passion that could not be contained within the walls of their respective marriages. The letters are a silent testimony to a relationship that, in life, was hidden from the world, and in death, is laid bare for all to see. The boys run, their shouts echoing through the morning air, and soon the scene is swarming with neighbors, police, and the curious. The sun rises over DeRussey's Lane, casting long shadows across the bodies and illuminating the horror in stark relief. The investigation begins, but already the evidence is being trampled, the story muddied by the crush of onlookers and the chaos of a crime that no one is prepared to solve. As the authorities arrive, they take in the details with a mixture of professionalism and disbelief. The arrangement of the bodies is too careful, too deliberate. The torn letters, the calling card, the absence of blood where there should be pools of it. All of it suggests a crime not of passion, but of calculation. The police cordon off the area, but it is too late. The scene has been compromised, the evidence tainted by the footprints of the morbidly curious. In the days that follow, the story spreads like wildfire. The names of the dead are whispered in parlors and shouted in the streets. Reverend Hall, the respected pastor of St. John the Evangelist Episcopal Church, and Mrs. Mills, the devoted choir singer, are suddenly the protagonists in a scandal that threatens to upend the very fabric of New Brunswick society. The church is thrown into turmoil, the congregation divided between those who mourn and those who judge. The press descends, their headlines growing more lurid with each edition. Lovers' bodies found in orchard, pastor and choir singer slain in cold blood. The details, real and imagined, are picked over by reporters hungry for sensation. The public is enthralled, and the case becomes a national obsession. But beneath the spectacle, the truth remains elusive. Who killed Edward Hall and Eleanor Mills? Was it a crime of jealousy, a lover's triangle turned deadly? Or was it something darker, a conspiracy rooted in the secrets of the church and the ambitions of those who stood to gain from their deaths? As the investigation unfolds, the shadows lengthen over DeRussey's Lane. The crabapple tree, once a silent witness to clandestine meetings and whispered promises, now stands as a grim monument to a mystery that will never be fully unraveled. The bodies are taken away, the letters collected as evidence, but the questions linger, unanswered, unanswerable. The Hall Mills murders have begun their slow, inexorable journey into legend. The city of New Brunswick will never be the same. A thin mist clings to the ground as the first rays of morning light filter through the tangled branches above de Russey's Lane. The air is heavy, thick with the scent of damp earth and fallen crab apples, as if the world itself is holding its breath. In this hush, the crime scene reveals itself in chilling detail, a tableau that will haunt investigators and onlookers alike for decades. Reverend Edward Hall's body lies supine, his head tilted slightly to the right, eyes half open as if caught between sleep and a final, unspoken thought. At his polished shoes, almost reverently placed, is his calling card. Edward Wheeler Hall, Rector, St. John the Evangelist. The card's edges are crisp, unmarred by the dew, as though it had been set down with deliberate care after the violence had ended. It is a silent, damning signature, an identity made public in death, as if to ensure no confusion about who lies here. Beside him, Eleanor Mills's form is more grotesquely marked by violence. Her dress, modest and floral, is stained with blood at the collar and chest. Her throat has been savagely cut, the wound deep and ragged, exposing the white of her windpipe and the glistening red of muscle beneath. The brutality is at odds with the almost peaceful arrangement of her hands, folded over her abdomen, fingers laced as if in prayer. Her face is turned toward Hall, lips parted, eyes wide and unseeing fixed forever on the man who shared her secret life. Between them, the grass is littered with scraps of paper. Torn edges flutter in the faint breeze, some stained with blood, others smudged with dirt. These are the remnants of love letters, pages ripped hastily from their envelopes, sentences half legible and looping script. My dearest, I long for you. If only we could be together. The words are raw, desperate, and now exposed to the world. Each fragment is a confession, a testament to a passion that could not be contained, now laid bare in the most public and humiliating way imaginable. The arrangement of the bodies is too careful, too staged. Hall's hat sits neatly beside his head, and his glasses are folded and placed on his chest. Mills's handbag rests by her side, its contents spilled but not rifled through, as if the killer wanted to prove that robbery was never the motive. The torn letters form a rough arc between the two victims, a symbolic bridge of longing and secrecy now forever broken. Blood stains the grass in dark, congealed patches. Yet, strangely, there is less blood than one might expect from such wounds. Investigators will later speculate that the bodies were moved post-mortem, arranged here to send a message or to shield the true location of the crime. The absence of drag marks and the careful positioning only deepen the mystery. Around the scene, the footprints of early gawkers and police officers have already begun to blur the evidence. Cigarette butts, dropped handkerchiefs, and the muddy prints of shoes large and small create a chaotic border to the otherwise meticulous display. The morning sun climbs higher, casting harsh light on every detail of the torn fabric at Mills's neckline, the glint of Hall's cufflinks, the stark white of the calling card. A hush falls over those gathered, broken only by the murmurs of the first officers on the scene. Look at this, one whispers, pointing to the card. He wanted us to know who he was. Another shakes his head, eyes fixed on the blood-soaked letters. Or someone wanted us to know what they'd done. The scene is gruesome, yes, but it is also theatrical, a performance of death, staged for maximum impact. Every detail seems to hint at motive, at message, at a killer who wanted not just to end two lives, but to expose them, shame them, and ensure their secret would never die quietly. As the morning wears on, the crowd grows. Reporters push through the police line, snapping photographs, scribbling notes. Neighbors whisper about the affair, how Hall and Mills were often seen together after choir practice, how their glances lingered a moment too long. The torn letters confirmed what many had only dared to suspect. This was a crime of passion, of betrayal, of secrets brought violently into the light. But beneath the surface, the clues are contradictory. Why the careful placement? Why the calling card? Why scatter the letters so publicly, yet leave valuables untouched? The scene is a riddle, each detail a piece of a puzzle that refuses to fit. As the bodies are finally removed, the crabapple tree stands silent once more, its branches heavy with fruit and memory. The grass will grow back, the blood will fade, but the image of that morning, the calling card, the letters, the slashed throat, will linger in the minds of all who saw it. The Hall Mills murders have left their mark, not just on the earth of DeRussey's Lane, but on the soul of a community that will never be the same. News of the murders tore through New Brunswick like a thunderclap, shattering the quiet routines of the city and igniting a frenzy that would soon engulf the nation. In the first hours after the discovery, whispers of the crime crept from neighbor to neighbor, but by midday, the full, lurid details were splashed across newspaper headlines. The respected Reverend Edward Hall and choir singer Eleanor Mills, found dead together beneath a crabapple tree, their bodies grotesquely arranged, love letters torn and scattered between them. The implication was inescapable. This was no random act of violence, but a revelation of a secret affair, now exposed in the most public and brutal manner possible. The shock was immediate and profound. Hall, the Episcopal priest, had been a pillar of the community, his sermons drawing the devout and the curious alike. Mills, a devoted wife and mother, was known for her voice in the choir and her presence at every church function. Their families, their congregation, and the wider city reeled as the truth emerged. The two had been lovers, their clandestine relationship now laid bare by death. The scandal was electric, and it crackled through every parlor, street corner, and pew. Within hours, the crime scene became a spectacle. Reporters and curiosity seekers descended on DeRussey's Lane, trampling the grass, stripping bark from the crabapple tree as souvenirs, and passing Hall's calling card from hand to hand. Vendors hawked refreshments to the swelling crowds, and the line between investigation and entertainment blurred. The tabloids, newly ascendant in American journalism, seized the story with relish. The New York Daily News, the Daily Mirror, and the New York Graphic dispatched teams to New Brunswick, each competing to outdo the other with sensational headlines and lurid speculation. The affair itself became the focal point of the coverage. The press published photographs of Hall and Mills, their families, and even their homes, dissecting every aspect of their lives for public consumption. The love letters, once private confessions, were quoted in print, their phrases of longing and desperation now fodder for a nation's curiosity. No detail was too small, no rumor too wild to print. The city's social fabric began to fray as neighbors eyed each other with suspicion and gossip supplanted fact. The revelation of the affair also transformed the investigation. What might have been a straightforward, if shocking, murder case now became a labyrinth of motives and suspects. Was this a crime of passion, committed by a jealous spouse or a wrong lover? Or was it something more sinister, a conspiracy among the city's elite to silence scandal? The police, overwhelmed and often at odds over jurisdiction, struggled to contain the chaos. As the days passed, the initial shock gave way to a kind of collective obsession. Judges urged grand juries to convene, and rival prosecutors raced to turn up new leads, each eager to claim credit for solving the case. But the evidence had already been hopelessly compromised by the crowds and the press. The truth of what happened on DeRussey's Lane was now tangled in a web of speculation, innuendo, and sensationalism. In the end, the exposure of Hall and Mills's affair did more than reveal a private transgression. It transformed a local tragedy into a national spectacle, forever changing the way Americans consumed news and understood scandal. The city of New Brunswick, once shocked into silence, now found itself the unwilling stage for a drama that would echo through history, its secrets and sorrows laid bare for the world to see. The investigation into the Hall Mills murders began under a cloud of confusion and chaos, setting the stage for one of the most bungled crime scenes in American history. The bodies of Reverend Edward Hall and Eleanor Mills were discovered on the morning of September 16, 1922, in a field just over the border from New Brunswick, technically in Somerset County. Yet, it was the New Brunswick police from Middlesex County who arrived first, drawn by the proximity to their city and the prominence of the victims. Almost immediately, a jurisdictional tug-of-war erupted between the two counties, neither willing to yield control of what was quickly becoming a sensational case. While the authorities debated, the crime scene descended into a spectacle. News of the grisly double murder had spread like wildfire, and by the time police began their work, a throng of curiosity seekers, neighbors, and reporters had already gathered at DeRussey's Lane. The crowd surged past any semblance of a police line, trampling the grass, muddying the ground, and obliterating footprints or other subtle clues. Some stripped bark from the crabapple tree as grisly souvenirs, while others passed Hall's calling card from hand to hand, contaminating one of the few pieces of physical evidence at the scene. The chaos only deepened as police from both counties arrived and began to argue over who had authority. The bodies, positioned side by side with deliberate care, were left exposed as officers debated procedures and responsibilities. The physical evidence, already sparse and fragile, was further compromised by the crush of onlookers and the lack of coordinated control. The torn love letters, scattered between the bodies, were picked up and examined by multiple hands before being collected. Hall's missing gold watch and other personal effects were noted, but the possibility of theft or staged robbery was muddled by the disorder. As the hours passed, the investigation became a contest not just between police departments, but between county prosecutors, each eager to claim the case and the headlines that came with it. Judges in both Middlesex and Somerset counties urged their grand juries to begin hearings, and rival prosecutors began interviewing witnesses and turning up stories, often working at cross purposes. The result was a patchwork of statements, conflicting timelines, and lost opportunities. The press, emboldened by the lack of police control, chronicled every misstep. Reporters interviewed witnesses before police could, and rumors quickly became accepted fact in the public imagination. The investigation, already hampered by a lack of forensic sophistication, was further crippled by the loss and contamination of evidence. The initial days, so crucial in any murder inquiry, were squandered in confusion, rivalry, and spectacle. By the time the state intervened and the Attorney General's office took over the case, the damage was irreversible. Key evidence had vanished or was hopelessly tainted, and the testimony of witnesses was colored by the chaos and the glare of publicity. The Hall Mills murders, from the very start, were less a search for truth than a grim pageant of missed chances and human folly, a tragedy compounded by the very institutions meant to deliver justice. Suspicion in the Hall Mills murders soon settled upon Frances Noel Stevens Hall, the widow of Reverend Edward Hall, and her two brothers, William Willie Carpenter Stevens and Henry Hugill Stevens. The Hall and Stevens families were among the most prominent in New Brunswick, their names woven into the city's history and its wealth. Frances herself was related to the Carpenters, Nielsen's, and possibly even the Johnsons of Johnson & Johnson, a lineage that brought both privilege and scrutiny in the wake of the crime. Frances Hall was a figure of composure and reserve, her public persona marked by dignity and a certain coldness that, in the eyes of some, bordered on aloofness. In the weeks before the murders, Eleanor Mills's teenage daughter, Charlotte, would later recall that Mrs. Hall had turned cold toward her mother, a chilling prelude to the violence that would follow. The prosecution's theory was as simple as it was sensational. Frances, driven by jealousy and humiliation over her husband's affair, orchestrated the murders, enlisting her eccentric brothers as accomplices. Willie Stevens, the elder brother, was a peculiar character, intelligent, reclusive, and often described as odd by those who knew him. He was known for his erratic mannerisms and sharp wit, traits that would later make him both a curiosity and a challenge for prosecutors and journalists alike. Henry Stevens, by contrast, was more conventional in appearance, but no less formidable in reputation. Together, the siblings formed a trio whose wealth and social standing could not shield them from the glare of suspicion. The investigation, already hampered by a chaotic crime scene and warring police jurisdictions, soon focused on the Hall household. Frances's alibi, that she had spent the evening with her husband's visiting niece and later searched for Edward with Willie, came under intense scrutiny. Police questioned her repeatedly, even forcing her to don the gray coat she had worn that night and submit to inspection by witnesses. The press seized on every detail, painting Frances as a woman scorned, her brothers as willing co-conspirators, and the family mansion as a fortress of secrets. Rumors flourished that Frances had hired private detectives to follow her husband, that the Stevens brothers had been seen lurking near the scene of the murders, that bribes and threats had been used to silence witnesses. The prosecution would later point to a crucial piece of evidence: Edward Hall's calling card, found at the crime scene, bearing Willie's thumbprint, as proof of the family's involvement. Testimony from church vestryman Ralph Gorsline, who admitted to being in the Lover's Lane the night of the murders, added fuel to the fire, especially when he claimed to have been threatened by Willie and bribed by Henry. Yet, for all the circumstantial evidence and whispered accusations, the case against Frances and her brothers was far from airtight. Their wealth and connections afforded them the best legal defense money could buy, and their every move was watched and analyzed by a press corps hungry for scandal. The trial, when it finally came, would be a spectacle unlike any the country had seen: a clash of class, gender, and public fascination, with Frances Hall and her brothers at its center. As the investigation dragged on, the city of New Brunswick became a stage for suspicion and spectacle. The Hall Mills case was no longer just a murder mystery. It was a drama of family, privilege, and the corrosive power of secrets. And at the heart of it all stood Frances Hall, her composure unbroken, her innocence or guilt a matter of endless debate, a prime suspect in a case that would forever remain unsolved. Rumors began to swirl almost immediately after the discovery of the bodies, gathering momentum with every whispered conversation in the pews of St. John the Evangelist and every furtive glance exchanged on the streets of New Brunswick. The city, already stunned by the brutality and spectacle of the murders, now found itself awash in a tide of suspicion, jealousy, and betrayal that seemed to seep from the very walls of the church and the Hall household itself. Within the congregation, few were truly surprised to learn of the affair between Reverend Hall and Eleanor Mills. It was an open secret, discussed in hushed tones by parishioners who had seen the two linger after choir practice, exchanged knowing glances during Sunday services, or passed folded letters hidden in hymnals. Eleanor, a devoted churchgoer, attended St. John's almost daily, and Hall's frequent visits to the Mills household had not gone unnoticed. Even James Mills, Eleanor's husband and the church's custodian, seemed to tolerate the relationship, perhaps out of resignation or a quiet understanding that his wife's affections had shifted elsewhere. Yet the affair was more than a private scandal. It was a catalyst for deeper resentments and anxieties within the church community. Frances Hall, Edward's wife, was a woman of wealth and lineage, heiress to the Stevens and Johnson fortunes, and accustomed to a life of social standing and control. The humiliation of her husband's public infidelity was a wound made all the deeper by the gossip that festered in the drawing rooms and parlors of New Brunswick. Some whispered that Frances had known of the affair for years, that she had hired private detectives to follow her husband, and that she had confided in her brothers, Willie and Henry Stevens, both eccentric figures whose presence in the Hall mansion was as constant as it was unsettling. The Stevens brothers became the subjects of their own dark rumors. Willie, in particular, was viewed as peculiar, intelligent, but socially awkward, with a penchant for odd behavior and a reputation for being fiercely protective of his sister. Henry was more reserved, but no less implicated in the growing web of suspicion. Both were said to have resented Hall's betrayal, not only for the shame it brought upon Frances, but for the threat it posed to the family's reputation and fortune. Stories circulated of heated arguments within the Hall home, of veiled threats and accusations exchanged behind closed doors. Some claimed to have overheard Willie vowing to take care of anyone who hurt Frances. Others spoke of Frances herself, her composure cracking in private moments as she raged against her husband's betrayal. There were allegations that Frances, with her brother's support, had plotted to catch Hall and Mills together, to confront them and put an end to the affair once and for all. The rumors extended beyond the family and into the heart of the church. Parishioners debated whether Hall's sermons had grown more distracted, whether Mills's singing carried a note of longing or guilt. The vestryman, Ralph Gorsline, was drawn into the intrigue when it was revealed that he, too, had been present near the Lover's Lane on the night of the murders, allegedly with a woman not his wife. Some said he had been bribed or threatened by the Stevens brothers to keep silent about what he had seen. Others suggested that a network of church members, including Sunday school teachers and choir members, had acted as informal spies, feeding information about Hall and Mills's meetings to Francis Hall. The press, sensing the undercurrents of scandal and resentment, fanned the flames with relentless coverage. Every new detail, no matter how unsubstantiated, was reported as fact: that Frances Hall had confronted her husband with a pistol, that Willie Stevens had been seen lurking near the crime scene, that Henry Stevens had threatened witnesses or paid hush money to keep the family's secrets buried. The newspapers published verbatim transcripts of the love notes found at the scene, their phrases of longing and desperation now public property, fueling the city's collective obsession. In this atmosphere of suspicion and betrayal, the line between truth and rumor became hopelessly blurred. The investigation, already compromised by jurisdictional disputes and a trampled crime scene, was further hampered by the reluctance of witnesses to come forward, fearful of retribution or social ruin. Some parishioners claimed to have seen Frances or her brothers near DeRussey's Lane on the night of the murders. Others insisted they had been at home, their alibis supported by servants whose testimonies would later be challenged and picked apart in court. The Hall Mills case thus became not only a murder mystery but a study in the corrosive power of rumor and suspicion. The church, once a sanctuary, was now a battleground of whispered accusations and shattered trust. The Hall household, a symbol of wealth and respectability, was transformed into a fortress besieged by scandal. And as the rumors continued to swirl, the true story of what happened on that September night receded further into the shadows, obscured by a fog of jealousy, betrayal, and fear that would never fully lift from New Brunswick. Jane Gibson was, by all accounts, an unlikely witness, a pig farmer living in a converted barn just off DeRussey's Lane, known to her neighbors as eccentric, independent, and fiercely protective of her land. She and her son, William, eked out a modest existence on the outskirts of New Brunswick, their days marked by the routines of rural life and the persistent threat of corn thieves who prowled the fields at night. But on the night of September 14, 1922, Jane Gibson's world collided with the city's darkest secret, and her testimony would become the most dramatic and controversial element of the Hall Mills murder case. That night, as dusk deepened and the air grew heavy with the scent of earth and livestock, Jane was roused by the insistent barking of her dog. Fearing another raid on her corn, she saddled her mule, Jenny, and rode out into the fields, a lantern swinging from her hand. The moon was bright enough to cast long shadows across the rows of corn and the tangled undergrowth near the crabapple tree where, unknown to her, a crime of passion was about to unfold. Jane's account, given first to police and later to the press and the grand jury, was vivid and chilling. She claimed she saw a man standing in her cornfield, and as she approached, she noticed 4 figures gathered near the crabapple tree, 2 men and 2 women, their features obscured by the night but their movements tense and urgent. She watched from the cover of darkness, her heart pounding, as voices rose in argument. Suddenly, she heard a woman's voice cry out, "Don't, don't, don't." The words echoed across the field, desperate and terrified. Then came the gunshots, sharp cracks that shattered the night. Jane saw one figure fall, then another. She turned her mule and fled, but not before hearing more shots and a final, chilling scream. In her later retellings, Jane insisted she heard a woman shout the name Henry, a detail that would later be seized upon by prosecutors eager to tie the crime to Francis Hall's brother, Henry Stevens. Jane's story, dramatic as it was, changed in its details with each telling. Sometimes she said she saw only 3 people, other times 4. The order of the shots, the identity of the figures, even the direction from which she approached, all seemed to shift depending on her audience. Yet the core of her account remained the same. She had witnessed, from the shadows of her own fields, the murder of Edward Hall and Eleanor Mills. The press seized on Jane Gibson's testimony, dubbing her the Pig Woman and transforming her into a figure of both fascination and ridicule. Reporters described her as quirky and colorful, her rural mannerisms and plain speech a stark contrast to the refined society figures at the center of the case. When the trial finally began in 1926, Jane was gravely ill with cancer. In a scene that would become legendary in American legal history, she was wheeled into the courtroom on a hospital bed, her presence electrifying the proceedings. When asked to identify the perpetrators, she rose from her bed, pointed a trembling finger at Frances Hall and her brothers, and declared them responsible for the crime. Yet Jane's credibility was relentlessly attacked by the defense. They painted her as uneducated, unreliable, and even crazy, citing the inconsistencies in her story and the lack of corroborating evidence. Friends and townspeople challenged her account, and the grand jury, after hearing from 67 witnesses, declined to indict anyone in the initial investigation. Still, Jane's testimony lingered in the public imagination, a tantalizing glimpse into the darkness of that September night, a story that, for all its contradictions, offered the only eyewitness account of what might have happened beneath the crabapple tree. Jane Gibson's legacy is inseparable from the Hall Mills case, a symbol of the case's enduring mystery and the blurred line between fact and folklore. Her story, alternately believed and dismissed, remains one of the most haunting elements of a crime that, more than a century later, still resists resolution. The Hall Mills murders did not merely shock New Brunswick, they ignited a media firestorm that transformed a local tragedy into one of America's first true media circuses, setting a precedent for sensationalized crime coverage that would echo through the decades. In the early 1920s, tabloid journalism was still a novelty, but the lurid details of the case, an adulterous priest, a slain choir singer, love letters torn and scattered across a moonlit field, were irresistible to editors and readers alike. The New York Daily News, the Daily Mirror, and the New York Graphic dispatched teams of reporters to New Jersey, their coverage blurring the line between journalism and spectacle. The crime scene itself became a sideshow. Crowds descended daily on DeRussey's Lane, not just to gawk but to collect souvenirs, stripping bark from the crabapple tree, pocketing bits of grass, and even passing around Hall's calling card. Vendors sold balloons and refreshments to the throngs, and the ground was so trampled that any remaining evidence was hopelessly compromised. The press, far from acting as impartial observers, fueled the chaos. The New York Daily News even staged a séance at the murder site, complete with a fake medium, while the Mirror sent reporters to dig up witnesses or fabricate new leads. Tabloid headlines screamed the latest rumors and theories, often with little regard for fact. The private lives of the victims and their families were dissected in print, with verbatim transcripts of Hall and Mills's love notes published for all to read. Frances Hall, her brothers, and even peripheral figures became household names, their reputations battered by relentless coverage. The case's cast of characters, eccentric witnesses like Jane Gibson, the pig woman, and the wealthy, enigmatic Hall Stevens clan, were painted in broad, dramatic strokes, their every move scrutinized and sensationalized. The legal proceedings were equally theatrical. Reporters packed the courthouse, sending updates via the latest radio and newswire technology, ensuring that every twist and revelation reached a national audience almost instantly. The case was so widely covered that even state publications like the New York Times adopted a tabloid tone, focusing on the personalities and scandals rather than sober biographical facts. The relentless publicity not only shaped public opinion but also affected the investigation itself, as witnesses came forward or were invented based on the latest headlines, and prosecutors felt pressure to deliver a dramatic resolution. This unprecedented media attention played a direct role in the reopening of the case in 1926, as new rumors and alleged confessions surfaced, often originating from or amplified by the tabloids. Even years after the trial ended in acquittal, the Hall Mills murders remained a touchstone for true crime reporting. Books, retrospectives, and anniversary articles continued to revisit the case, cementing its legacy as the first sensationalized trial and a blueprint for the media-driven spectacles that would follow. In the end, the Hall Mills case was as much a product of its press coverage as of its facts, a tragedy whose enduring mystery was magnified, distorted, and immortalized by a media machine hungry for scandal, drama, and the darkest corners of human intrigue. The accusation against Frances Hall was as sensational as it was scandalous. That she, wounded by her husband's betrayal and desperate to preserve her family's honor, orchestrated the murders of Edward Hall and Eleanor Mills with the help of her brothers, Willie and Henry Stevens. The theory, eagerly embraced by prosecutors and the press alike, was that Frances, alerted to the affair through gossip, intercepted letters, or even private detectives, resolved to catch the lovers in the act and exact a terrible retribution. The prosecution's narrative was vivid and dramatic. On the night of the murders, they argued, Frances and her brothers set out together, perhaps accompanied by their cousin Henry Carpenter, to confront Edward and Eleanor at their clandestine meeting spot beneath the crabapple tree. The confrontation, prosecutors claimed, turned violent. Reverend Hall was shot once, Eleanor Mills 3 times, and her throat was slashed so savagely that her voice box was nearly removed, an act interpreted as a symbolic silencing of her transgressive love. Jane Gibson, the pig woman, became the state's star witness. Her testimony, delivered from a hospital bed in the courtroom, painted a scene of confrontation and chaos. She claimed to have seen Frances, Willie, and Henry at the murder site, to have heard a woman's screams and gunshots, and to have witnessed the aftermath as the conspirators fled into the night. The prosecution bolstered her account with testimony from other witnesses who alleged that Frances had tried to bribe them into silence, that Henry had been seen in New Brunswick when he claimed to be elsewhere, and that Willie's thumbprint was found on Edward Hall's calling card at the crime scene. Rumors and innuendo swirled around the Hall household. Stories circulated that Frances had intercepted Eleanor's love letters, that she had confronted her husband with threats and ultimatums, and that she had confided in her fiercely loyal brothers, who were reputed to be both eccentric and protective. The defense, for their part, painted Frances as a paragon of composure and dignity, and they attacked the credibility of the prosecution's witnesses, especially Jane Gibson, whose story had shifted over time and who was subjected to withering cross-examination about her character and reliability. The trial itself was a spectacle, drawing hundreds of reporters and turning the Somerset County Courthouse into a stage for national fascination. The streets outside became a country fair, with souvenir stands and throngs of onlookers, while inside, the drama played out before a jury tasked with untangling fact from rumor, truth from theater. Despite the prosecution's efforts, the case against Frances and her brothers ultimately unraveled. The evidence was largely circumstantial, the witnesses inconsistent or discredited, and the defense skillfully cast doubt on every accusation. After a month-long trial, the jury acquitted Frances, Willie, and Henry Stevens of all charges. No one was ever convicted for the murders of Edward Hall and Eleanor Mills, and the shadow of suspicion, fueled by jealousy, betrayal, and the relentless glare of public scrutiny, remained over the Hall household long after the courtroom had emptied. From the very first hours after the discovery of the bodies, the investigation into the Hall Mills murders was plagued by carelessness, confusion, and a near-total disregard for the preservation of evidence. The crime scene, located in a secluded field off DeRussey's Lane, quickly became a public spectacle rather than a controlled site of forensic inquiry. Crowds of curiosity seekers, neighbors, and reporters converged on the spot, trampling the grass, stripping bark from the crabapple tree, and even passing around Reverend Hall's calling card as a grim souvenir. Vendors hawked refreshments to the gathering throngs, and the line between investigation and entertainment was hopelessly blurred. This chaos had devastating consequences for the collection and preservation of physical evidence. Hall's gold watch, a potentially crucial clue, was missing from his person and never recovered. The murder weapon, believed to be a .32 caliber pistol, was also never found, despite extensive searches of the area and nearby waterways. Other personal effects, such as Eleanor Mills's jewelry and Hall's glasses, were either disturbed or handled by multiple people before police could secure them. The torn love letters, which lay scattered between the bodies, were picked up and read by onlookers before being gathered as evidence, their order and context forever lost. The loss and contamination of evidence were compounded by the rivalry and lack of coordination between the police forces of Middlesex and Somerset counties. Each side jockeyed for control of the case, and in the process, vital clues were overlooked or mishandled. Reports and autopsy documents vanished from official files in the years that followed, and grand jury testimony was discovered in the personal possession of a prosecutor's brother, who was caught attempting to sell it to a newspaper. The chain of custody for nearly every piece of evidence was broken, making it impossible to reconstruct the events of that night with any certainty. By the time the case was revived for trial in 1926, much of the original evidence had either disappeared or been rendered useless. The prosecution faced the daunting task of building a case on hearsay, rumor, and the unreliable recollections of witnesses whose memories had been shaped by years of gossip and press coverage. The absence of the murder weapon and Hall's gold watch, in particular, left gaping holes in the narrative. Without these key items, the state could not definitively link any suspect to the crime scene, nor could they establish a clear timeline or motive. The missing evidence became both a symbol and a symptom of the investigation's failure. It was whispered that influential figures had deliberately mislaid or destroyed incriminating documents to protect the powerful families involved, though no proof of such a conspiracy ever emerged. What remained was a case built on shadows and speculation, its foundation fatally weakened by the very chaos and carelessness that had defined its earliest moments. In the end, the compromised and missing evidence ensured that the Hall Mills murders would remain unsolved, a chilling reminder of how justice can be thwarted not only by cunning criminals, but by the failings of those entrusted to uncover the truth. As the Hall Mills case unfolded, the investigation and subsequent trial became a tangle of conflicting witness accounts, accusations of bribery, and whispered threats. Each new revelation muddying the waters further and ensuring that the truth would remain elusive. From the outset, witnesses could not agree on what, or whom, they had seen near to Russey's Lane on the night of the murders. Some claimed to have spotted the Stevens brothers, Willie and Henry, lurking in the vicinity. Willie, eccentric and often described as odd, was said to have owned a .32 caliber pistol similar to the murder weapon, and his thumbprint was reportedly found on Reverend Hall's calling card left at the scene. Yet others, including 3 individuals, swore that Henry Stevens was miles away in Lavallette, New Jersey, fishing at the time of the killings. The confusion only deepened as the investigation progressed. Testimonies from individuals like Jane Gibson, the pig woman, placed Frances Hall, her brothers, and even a cousin, Henry Carpenter, at the scene, claiming to have witnessed a confrontation and heard a woman scream, "Don't," before the shots rang out. But Gibson's own story shifted over time, and her credibility was relentlessly attacked by the defense, who painted her as unreliable and evasive. Other witnesses came forward with stories that further complicated the narrative. Some alleged that they had been bribed or threatened to keep silent about what they knew. For example, a former servant of Mrs. Hall was said to have boasted about receiving $5,000 to stay quiet about her employer's whereabouts on the night of the murders. There were claims that Frances Hall had hired private detectives who attempted to influence key witnesses, and that Henry Stevens had confronted and sworn to secrecy a vestryman, Ralph Gorsline, who admitted to being near the scene with a woman not his wife. Gorsline's own testimony was fraught with contradictions, and he later confessed to being there but denied any involvement in the crime. The press eagerly reported on every twist, amplifying rumors of bribery and intimidation. One hearse driver testified that Frances Hall had fresh scratches on her cheek at her husband's funeral, suggesting a recent struggle. Others said that Willie Stevens had ominously remarked that something terrible had happened, even before the bodies were found. Yet, the defense was able to discredit many of these accounts, arguing that the witnesses were unreliable, motivated by money, or simply mistaken. The result was a trial marked by confusion and contradiction. Some witnesses placed the Stevens brothers at the scene, others provided alibis. Some claimed bribery and threats, others denied any such coercion. The prosecution's case, built on the shaky foundation, ultimately failed to convince the jury, who were left to navigate a maze of conflicting stories and unsubstantiated claims. In the end, The conflicting testimonies and allegations of bribery and threats became emblematic of the Hall Mills case itself, a mystery clouded by rumor, suspicion, and the fundamental unreliability of human memory. After years of mounting suspicion, public pressure, and relentless media scrutiny, the Hall Mills investigation reached a dramatic crescendo with the convening of a Somerset County grand jury in 1926. Spurred by new testimony, persistent rumors, and the unyielding gaze of the press, the grand jury indicted 4 members of the Hall and Stevens families. Frances Hall, the widow of Reverend Hall, her brothers Henry Hugill Stevens and William Willie Carpenter Stevens, and their cousin Henry de la Briere Carpenter. The decision was a watershed moment, signaling that the authorities were finally prepared to bring the city's most powerful and enigmatic family to account for the murders that had transfixed New Brunswick and the nation. The indictments themselves were steeped in drama and controversy. The prosecution's theory, shaped by years of speculation and new witness statements, was that Frances Hall, driven by jealousy and humiliation over her husband's affair, had enlisted her brothers and cousin to confront the lovers at their secret meeting place. The plan, prosecutors argued, was to catch Hall and Mills in flagrante delicto and to mete out a brutal, calculated punishment. The evidence, though largely circumstantial and tainted by the passage of time, included the infamous calling card found at the scene, bearing Willie Stevens' thumbprint, and the testimony of witnesses like Jane Gibson, the pig woman, who claimed to have seen the family at the scene on the night of the murders. Yet, even as the indictments were handed down, the prosecution faced immediate complications. The case against cousin Henry Carpenter was considered weaker than that against the others, relying more on association than direct evidence. As a result, Carpenter successfully petitioned to be tried separately from Frances and her brothers, a move that would ultimately see him never brought to trial. This separation underscored the fragility of the state's case and the challenges inherent in prosecuting a crime so deeply mired in rumor, conflicting testimony, and lost evidence. The trial of Frances, Willie, and Henry Stevens began on November 3, 1926, at the Somerset County Courthouse in Somerville. The proceedings quickly became a national spectacle, drawing throngs of reporters and curious onlookers. The courtroom was packed with journalists from across the country, eager to chronicle every twist in what had become one of America's most sensational murder trials. The social status of the defendants, scions of the Stevens, Carpenter, and Johnson families, added a layer of intrigue and class tension, turning the trial into not just a quest for justice, but a referendum on privilege, morality, and the American fascination with scandal. The prosecution's case relied heavily on the testimony of Jane Gibson, whose dramatic appearance in court, wheeled in on a hospital bed, gravely ill yet unwavering in her accusations, provided the trial's most unforgettable moment. Other witnesses, including church vestryman Ralph Gorsline, claimed to have seen or heard the defendants near the scene, and some alleged bribery and threats by the Hall Stevens family to silence key witnesses. The state painted a picture of a conspiracy born of jealousy and shame, orchestrated by Frances Hall and executed with the aid of her fiercely loyal brothers. Yet, for all the drama and spectacle, the prosecution's case was riddled with inconsistencies and undermined by the unreliability of its witnesses. Defense attorneys, led by some of the most formidable legal minds in New Jersey, systematically dismantled the state's arguments, highlighting the lack of physical evidence, the compromised crime scene, and the shifting stories of key witnesses. They portrayed Frances Hall as a dignified and wronged woman, her brothers as loyal but innocent, and the entire prosecution as a product of media hysteria rather than fact. After a month of testimony, cross-examination, and public spectacle, the jury acquitted Frances, Willie, and Henry Stevens of all charges. The separate case against Henry Carpenter was never pursued. The Hall Mills murders, despite years of investigation and a trial that captivated the nation, remained unsolved, a haunting reminder of how power, rumor, and the passage of time can conspire to keep the truth forever out of reach. The trial of Frances Hall, Henry Stevens, and William "Willie" Stevens began on November 3, 1926, at the Somerset County Courthouse in Somerville, New Jersey. A proceeding that would become a national spectacle and a defining moment in the annals of American true crime. For 30 days, the courthouse and the streets outside became the epicenter of a media frenzy, drawing reporters from every major newspaper in the country and turning the usually quiet town into a carnival of scandal, intrigue, and high society drama. The social status of the accused, members of the wealthy Stevens and Carpenter families, guaranteed that the trial would be watched with fascination and envy. The courthouse itself was transformed. More than 300 reporters filed stories via 60 leased telegraph wires, while a 129-position switchboard, recently used for a heavyweight boxing match, was installed to handle the flood of communications. Main Street, Somerville, was likened to a country fair, with souvenir stands and refreshment vendors catering to the crowds who gathered daily in hopes of catching a glimpse of the infamous defendants or the parade of eccentric witnesses. Inside the courtroom, the drama was no less intense. The prosecution, led by Alexander Simpson, argued that Frances Hall, driven by jealousy and humiliation over her husband's affair, orchestrated the murders with the help of her fiercely loyal brothers. The state's case rested on a patchwork of circumstantial evidence: the presence of Hall's calling card at the scene, bearing Willie Stevens' thumbprint, the testimony of church vestryman Ralph Gorsline, who admitted to being in the area that night and claimed to have been threatened and bribed by the Stevens brothers, and witnesses who alleged they had seen Henry Stevens near the scene, despite his insistence that he was far away in Lavalette. The trial's most unforgettable moment came when Jane Gibson, the eccentric pig farmer known as the Pig Woman, was wheeled into court on a hospital bed, gravely ill but determined to testify. Her dramatic account, in which she claimed to have seen Frances Hall and her brothers at the murder scene, electrified the courtroom. When asked to identify the perpetrators, she rose from her bed and pointed directly at the defendants, an act described by the New York Daily Mirror as the most dramatic scene ever witnessed in a courtroom. Yet, the defense, led by some of New Jersey's most formidable attorneys, systematically dismantled the prosecution's case. They highlighted inconsistencies in witness testimony, particularly Jane Gibson's shifting accounts, and painted her as unreliable and eccentric. They also emphasized the lack of direct physical evidence, the compromised crime scene, and the questionable motives of those who claimed to have been bribed or threatened. The trial captivated the nation, not only for its lurid details but for the spectacle of privilege, scandal, and the clash between old money and modern media. For a month, every development was breathlessly reported, every rumor magnified, and every courtroom outburst dissected in print. When the verdict finally came, acquittal for Frances Hall and her brothers, the sense of anticlimax was palpable, but the fascination with the case endured. The Hall Mills trial, with its blend of social intrigue, media circus, and unresolved mystery, marked a turning point in American criminal justice and journalism, a spectacle that set the standard for every sensational trial that would follow. Jane Gibson's testimony at the Hall Mills murder trial was the centerpiece of the prosecution's case, a moment of high drama that captured the nation's attention and became emblematic of the trial's sensational character. By November 1926, Gibson, already known to the public as the Pig Woman for the hogs she raised on her farm near the murder scene, was gravely ill with cancer. Yet the prosecution, determined to present her as their star eyewitness, arranged for her to be brought into the packed Somerset County courtroom on a hospital bed, her frail figure swathed in blankets and her face drawn with pain. The spectacle was unforgettable. As the press described it, Gibson's bed was wheeled to the witness stand, and the entire courtroom fell silent. When asked by the prosecutor to identify the perpetrators, she summoned her strength, rose up from her bed, and pointed directly at Frances Hall and her brothers, declaring them responsible for the murders. The moment was so dramatic that the New York Daily Mirror called it the most dramatic scene ever witnessed in a courtroom. The public and press were riveted, and for a brief moment, it seemed as if the mystery might finally be solved by this extraordinary display. But the defense was prepared. From the outset, they sought to undermine Gibson's credibility, painting her as eccentric, uneducated, and unreliable. They seized on the fact that her story had changed over time. Her account to the police differed from what she told newspapers, and both differed from her testimony in court. At times, she described seeing 4 people at the scene, at others, only 3. The order of events, the identities of the figures she claimed to have seen, and even the direction from which she approached the murder site all seemed to shift with each retelling. The defense's attack was relentless and personal. They questioned Gibson about her marital status, her previous husbands, and her reputation in the community. Her vague and evasive answers, coupled with the inconsistencies in her story, cast further doubt on her reliability. The defense even called Gibson's own mother to the stand, who, sitting in the front row, loudly declared, "She is a liar, a liar, a liar," as her daughter testified. This public repudiation by her own family was devastating, and the jury could not ignore it. Neighbors and acquaintances also challenged Gibson's account, some claiming she was a habitual liar or had been bribed in the past to corroborate stories. Reports surfaced that a civilian had paid her $100 for corroboration years earlier, and the press gleefully reported every new doubt cast upon her character. The prosecution's reliance on Gibson, whose testimony was meant to be the linchpin of their case, began to backfire as the defense's cross-examination exposed the weaknesses in her story and her character. In the end, the jury was unconvinced. One juror later admitted he would have stayed in deliberation for 30 years rather than convict anyone on the evidence provided by the pig woman. The spectacle of Jane Gibson's testimony, rather than sealing the case, became a cautionary tale about the perils of relying on dramatic but unreliable witnesses. After a short deliberation, Frances Hall and her brothers were acquitted of all charges, and the Hall Mills murders remained unsolved, a mystery overshadowed by the unforgettable image of a dying woman pointing from her hospital bed, and the doubts that ultimately undid her story. As the trial unfolded in the autumn of 1926, a parade of witnesses took the stand, many drawn from the congregation of St. John the Evangelist Episcopal Church and the surrounding community. Their testimonies promised to shed light on the murky circumstances of that fateful night, but instead they deepened the fog of uncertainty, revealing a web of secret affairs, whispered confessions, and conflicting recollections that only fueled the trial's sensationalism. Several church members admitted under oath to their own indiscretions, confessing to extramarital affairs or inappropriate liaisons within the congregation. These revelations painted a picture of a community rife with hidden passions and betrayals, where the line between sacred duty and human frailty was blurred. The affair between Reverend Edward Hall and Eleanor Mills, once a whispered rumor, was contextualized as part of a broader pattern of secret relationships, adding layers of motive and jealousy to the prosecution's narrative. Among the most notable witnesses was Ralph Gorsline, a vestryman and assistant manager for one of the companies owned by the Hall-Stevens family. Gorsline admitted to being near the murder scene on the night of the killings, accompanied by a woman who was not his wife, a fact he had previously denied. His testimony was explosive. He claimed to have heard gunshots and to have been threatened by Willie Stevens and bribed by Henry Stevens to keep silent. Yet even Gorsline's account was riddled with contradictions, and his shifting story raised doubts about his reliability. Other witnesses claimed to have heard the fatal gunshots or seen figures moving near DeRussey's Lane that night, but their descriptions varied wildly. Some placed Henry Stevens in the area despite his insistence that he was fishing miles away in Lavallette, New Jersey. Others alleged that Frances Hall had attempted to bribe them or intimidate them into silence, undermining the defendant's alibis. Yet these claims were often based on hearsay or second-hand information, and many witnesses had personal or financial motives that cast shadows over their credibility. The inconsistencies in witness testimony were stark. Where one witness swore they saw Frances Hall near the scene, another insisted she was safely ensconced at home. Some described hearing a woman scream followed by gunshots. Others heard nothing unusual. The timelines offered by various witnesses conflicted, making it impossible to establish a definitive sequence of events. This cacophony of voices, each with its own version of the truth, left the jury struggling to separate fact from fiction. The defense capitalized on these contradictions, systematically exposing the weaknesses in the prosecution's case. They highlighted the lack of corroboration among witnesses and pointed to the potential biases and ulterior motives behind many accusations. The revelation of affairs within the church was used to question the moral authority of the witnesses themselves, suggesting that their testimonies were tainted by personal failings and grudges. Ultimately, the inconsistent accounts of church members and other witnesses underscored the complexity and opacity of the Hall Mills case. Rather than illuminating the truth, their conflicting stories contributed to a narrative clouded by doubt and suspicion. The trial became less a search for justice and more a reflection of a community grappling with scandal, secrecy, and the human capacity for deception, elements that ensured the murders would remain an enduring mystery. The defense's strategy in the Hall Mills murder trial was both methodical and ruthless, focusing on the glaring lack of physical evidence and systematically dismantling the credibility of the prosecution's witnesses. From the outset, defense attorneys Robert H. McCarter and Timothy N. Pfeiffer made it clear that the state's case was built on a foundation of speculation, hearsay, and unreliable testimony rather than hard proof. First, the defense highlighted the absence of any direct physical evidence linking Francis Hall, Henry Stevens, or Willie Stevens to the crime scene. The murder weapon, a .32 caliber handgun, was never recovered, and Hall's missing gold watch, which could have provided a crucial link or motive, was also never found. The only tangible piece of evidence was Reverend Hall's calling card, found at the scene with Willie Stevens' thumbprint, but the defense argued that the card could have been planted or innocently handled by Willie at any time, especially given the chaotic contamination of the crime scene by onlookers and reporters. The defense then turned its attention to the prosecution's witnesses, attacking their reliability and motives. The most dramatic example was Jane Gibson, the so-called pig woman, whose testimony was intended to be the prosecution's linchpin. Gibson, gravely ill, testified from a hospital bed brought into the courtroom, a spectacle that captivated the press and public. Yet, under cross-examination, the defense exposed the inconsistencies in her story. Her account of the night's events had changed multiple times, and her evasive answers about her personal life and previous marriages further eroded her credibility. The defense even called Gibson's own mother to the stand, who publicly denounced her daughter as a liar, a moment that left a lasting impression on the jury. Other prosecution witnesses fared no better. Church vestryman Ralph Gorsline, who admitted to being near the scene with a woman not his wife, was portrayed as morally compromised and unreliable. The defense suggested that witnesses had been bribed or pressured by private detectives allegedly hired by Francis Hall, further muddying the waters and casting doubt on the integrity of the entire investigation. Throughout the trial, the defense emphasized the defendant's social standing and character, painting Francis Hall and her brothers as refined, law-abiding citizens who had no history of violence or criminality. Have they been thugs? Have they criminal records? Are they thieves? No, they are refined, genteel, law-abiding people, the very highest type of character, church-going Christians, the defense declared in summation, contrasting them with the prosecution's sleazy and unreliable witnesses. Ultimately, the jury was persuaded by the defense's arguments. The lack of physical evidence, the compromised crime scene, and the discredited witnesses led to the acquittal of all three defendants. The trial's outcome was a testament to the power of a well-executed defense and a sobering reminder of how the absence of concrete evidence can leave even the most sensational crimes forever unsolved. After 4 years of rumor and speculation and a month of relentless courtroom drama, the Hall Mills murder trial drew to its close in December 1926. The nation watched as Francis Hall, Henry Stevens, and Willie Stevens, once the pillars of New Brunswick society, now the most infamous defendants in America, sat side by side in the crowded Somerset County courtroom, awaiting their fate. The air was thick with anticipation. The press corps, numbering in the hundreds, filled every available seat, their dispatches feeding a public hungry for resolution. The trial had been a spectacle from the start, a parade of eccentric witnesses, including the bedridden Jane Gibson, tales of secret affairs and veiled threats, and the defense's relentless attacks on the prosecution's evidence and character witnesses. The prosecution had built its case on a web of circumstantial evidence, innuendo, and the shifting testimony of individuals whose motives and memories were as tangled as the case itself. The defense, in contrast, had hammered home the absence of any direct physical evidence, the compromised crime scene, and the unreliability of the state's star witnesses. When the jury finally retired to deliberate, the world waited with bated breath. But the verdict came swiftly. After just 5 hours, the jury returned to the courtroom. The foreman stood, his voice steady, and announced the decision: not guilty for Francis Hall, not guilty for Henry Stevens, not guilty for Willie Stevens. The courtroom erupted, some in gasps of disbelief, others in quiet relief. Francis Hall wept quietly, her composure momentarily shattered. Her brothers sat in stunned silence. Outside, reporters dashed to telephones and telegraph wires, sending the news across the country within minutes. The acquittal was met with a mixture of shock, outrage, and resignation. Some in New Brunswick believed justice had been denied, that the powerful Hall Stevens family had escaped punishment through wealth and influence. Others saw the verdict as vindication, proof that the case against the defendants had always been more rumor than reality. The press, which had built the case into a national obsession, now turned to postmortems and retrospectives, dissecting every misstep and missed opportunity in the investigation and trial. No one else was ever charged with the murders of Edward Hall and Eleanor Mills. The case files, already incomplete and compromised, were boxed and stored in courthouse basements. The love letters, once so scandalous, faded into the yellowed pages of history. The crabapple tree in DeRussey's Lane, once a site of pilgrimage for the morbidly curious, returned to silence, its branches bearing silent witness to secrets that would never be fully revealed. For the families of the victims, there was no closure. James Mills, Eleanor's husband, returned to his quiet life as a church sexton, his grief and humiliation never far from the surface. Frances Hall retreated from public life, her reputation forever shadowed by suspicion. The Stevens brothers lived out their days in relative obscurity, their eccentricities now the stuff of local legend rather than national scandal. The Hall Mills case became a cautionary tale, a story of how justice can be derailed by sensationalism, social standing, and the frailties of human memory. It marked the end of an era in New Brunswick, a time when the city's secrets were exposed to the harsh light of public scrutiny, only to slip back into shadow when the circus moved on. The murders remained unsolved, the truth buried with the victims, and the legend of the case continued to haunt the American imagination, a reminder that some mysteries, no matter how public, are destined to remain forever unanswered. The aftermath of the Hall Mills trial left New Brunswick and its surrounding communities fractured in ways that would take generations to heal. The acquittal of Frances Hall and her brothers did not bring closure. Rather, it deepened the wounds that the murders had inflicted on the city's social fabric. The trial had forced into the open not only the secrets of the Hall and Stevens families, but also the undercurrents of jealousy, resentment, and class tension that had long simmered beneath the surface of New Brunswick society. In the weeks following the verdict, the city was abuzz with whispered conversations and pointed glances. For some, the acquittal confirmed their worst suspicions, that justice was a privilege of the wealthy, that the powerful could bend the system to their will, and that the truth could be bought or buried if one had enough influence. These residents nursed a quiet outrage, convinced that the real killers had walked free, and that the law had failed the victims and the community alike. Others, particularly those loyal to the Hall Stevens family or invested in the city's old social order, saw the verdict as proof that the accusations had always been driven by envy and sensationalism. They believed the family had been unfairly maligned, their reputations dragged through the mud by a press corps hungry for scandal and a public eager for spectacle. For them, the trial was a cautionary tale about the dangers of rumor and the destructive power of gossip. But for most, the dominant feeling was uncertainty. The conflicting testimony, the missing evidence, and the endless parade of rumors had made it impossible to know what to believe. The church, once a pillar of stability, was now a place of uneasy silence, its congregation divided between those who mourned Eleanor Mills and those who defended Frances Hall. Attendance at St. John the Evangelist dwindled, and the choir that had once been Eleanor's pride was left with empty seats and a lingering sense of loss. The families at the center of the case suffered most of all. Frances Hall, though acquitted, lived the rest of her days in the shadow of suspicion, her name forever linked to the crime. She withdrew from public life, her social calendar reduced to a trickle, her friendships strained or broken. The Stevens brothers, already known for their eccentricities, became reclusive, their once grand home a fortress against the curious and the judgmental. James Mills, Eleanor's widower, endured a quiet humiliation, his grief compounded by the knowledge that his wife's murder would never be avenged. For the wider community, the Hall Mills case became a touchstone for every whispered accusation and every new scandal. The phrase, like the Hall Mills case, entered local parlance as shorthand for unresolved mysteries and ruined reputations. The field where the bodies were found became a place of dark pilgrimage for years, visited by those drawn to the morbid or the unresolved, until time and new tragedies finally erased its infamy. The press, having moved on to fresher scandals, left behind a city forever changed. The trial had exposed the fragility of the social order, the ease with which suspicion could destroy lives, and the limits of the law in the face of wealth and influence. For decades, New Brunswick would be haunted by the ghosts of the Hall Mills murders, a community divided, its trust in justice shaken, its sense of itself forever altered by the secrets that had come to light and the truths that had slipped away. In the decades following the sensational acquittals in the Hall Mills murder case, the mystery continued to haunt New Brunswick and the broader American imagination. The community's wounds never fully healed, and the story's unresolved nature became fertile ground for new claims, confessions, and whispered secrets, none of which ever brought true closure or conclusive answers. Periodically, the case was revived in the press, especially around anniversaries or when a new witness or theory emerged. Newspapers and magazines would dig up old rumors or publish interviews with aging witnesses, each promising a fresh perspective or a long-hidden truth. The New York Daily Mirror, for example, played a significant role in resurrecting public interest in the case in the mid-1920s, leading to renewed investigations and, ultimately, the infamous 1926 trial. Over the years, individuals came forward with confessions or secondhand stories. Some claimed to have overheard deathbed admissions or to possess knowledge passed down from relatives who were close to the case. One such story involved a man named Julius, who, decades after the murders, told police he wanted to clear his conscience before he died. He recounted that Willie Stevens had allegedly asked him to deliver envelopes containing large sums of money to two men, purportedly the real killers, shortly after the murders. Julius even passed a lie detector test, but the men who allegedly received the money died without ever making confessions, and no hard evidence ever surfaced to corroborate his story. Other rumors suggested that Frances Hall or her associates had paid off witnesses or even participants in the crime, with stories of envelopes stuffed with thousands of dollars changing hands in the shadows of New Brunswick's elite circles. Some claimed to have inside knowledge about the missing murder weapon or Hall's gold watch, but searches and follow-up investigations yielded nothing substantial. There were also tales of secret confessions made to spouses or friends, but these too proved impossible to verify, often surfacing only after the supposed confessor had died. The passage of time only deepened the uncertainty. Memories faded, key figures passed away, and whatever physical evidence might have once existed was long lost or hopelessly compromised. The case files, already incomplete, gathered dust in courthouse archives, while the story itself slipped further into legend, a cautionary tale about the limits of justice, the corrosive power of rumor, and the enduring allure of an unsolved crime. Despite all the new claims and confessions, the Hall Mills murders remain one of America's most fascinating unsolved mysteries. Each new revelation seemed only to add another layer of ambiguity, reinforcing the sense that the truth, whatever it may have been, was destined to remain just out of reach. The Hall Mills murders, discovered on a dew-soaked September morning in 1922, have never yielded their secrets. The bodies of Reverend Edward Hall and Eleanor Mills, side by side beneath a crabapple tree, were found with chilling deliberateness, Hall's calling card at his feet, torn love letters scattered between them. Mills's throat slashed and both victims shot with a .32 caliber pistol. The scene was as much a message as a crime, and from the moment the news broke, New Brunswick was transformed, its quiet routines shattered by scandal, suspicion, and the relentless scrutiny of the press. The investigation was doomed almost from the outset. Jurisdictional confusion between Somerset and Middlesex counties meant that the crime scene was left unguarded, quickly overrun by crowds who trampled evidence, stripped bark from the tree as souvenirs, and even passed Hall's calling card among themselves. The physical evidence was irreparably compromised. Hall's gold watch and the murder weapon vanished, and the torn letters were handled by dozens before being gathered for the record. The initial days, so crucial in any murder inquiry, were lost to chaos, rivalry, and spectacle. Suspicion soon fell on Hall's wife, Frances, her brothers Willie and Henry Stevens, and their cousin Henry Carpenter. The grand jury indicted all four, but Carpenter was tried separately and never faced a jury. The trial of Frances and her brothers, beginning in November 1926, became a national sensation, emblematic of the era's fascination with scandal, class, and the dark undercurrents of American society. The prosecution's case relied heavily on the dramatic testimony of Jane Gibson, the pig woman, who claimed from her hospital bed that she had seen the defendants at the scene. Yet her story shifted with each retelling, and the defense, led by formidable attorneys, systematically dismantled the credibility of every witness, highlighting the lack of physical evidence and the contradictions in testimony. After a month of spectacle, the jury acquitted all three defendants. No one else was ever charged. The verdict did not heal the community. Instead, it left New Brunswick divided and haunted by suspicion. The Hall and Stevens families, once pillars of society, retreated into private shadows, their reputations forever stained. The church lost its innocence, its congregation riven by doubt and gossip. The city itself became a byword for scandal, its name forever linked to a mystery that would never be solved. Decades passed, but the case refused to fade from memory. New claims and confessions surfaced from time to time, rumors of bribes, deathbed admissions, and secret knowledge passed down through families. None provided conclusive answers, and each new revelation only deepened the sense of ambiguity and loss. The evidence was gone, the witnesses dead or discredited, and the truth, whatever it was, remained out of reach. The Hall Mills murders endure as a chilling testament to the power of secrets and scandal, and to the limits of justice in the face of wealth, influence, and human frailty. The field where the bodies were found is quiet now, the crabapple tree long gone, but the story lingers, a haunting reminder that some mysteries are destined never to be solved, and that the shadows cast by betrayal and violence can stretch across generations.